Next, we have Frederick Lock from the Department of English at Queen's University. Frederick is a leading authority on 18th century British politics, literature, and ideas. His two-volume study of Edmund Burke has been referred to as the definitive study of that most intellectual of British politicians. And that is, if we think beyond recent years, a considerable endorsement of both Burke and Frederick Lock's work. So, Frederick, I'm delighted to invite you forward.
My area of research is British culture in the 18th century, and especially the connections between history, literature, and politics. Three figures have engaged my particular interest: Jonathan Swift, an author whose work is suffused with politics; Edmund Burke, a politician whose writings and speeches have endured thanks to their literary qualities; and Edward Gibbon, a historian whose work is as memorable for its style and wit as for its powers of historical analysis. In their time, all three were part of the common culture of the reading classes. Since about 1800, however, the concept of literature has narrowed and disciplinary boundaries hardened, so that such writers of persuasive prose as Swift, Burke, and Gibbon have come to be regarded as marginal to literature proper. Conversely, historians are often suspicious or sceptical of the value of their writings as historical documents. A full and nuanced interpretation of these writers therefore requires a combination of the literary specialist's habits of close reading and the historian's awareness of cultural and political contexts. In the case of Swift, his masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels, is so easily read as a timeless satire that modern readers often miss or mistake the political and social agendas that Swift himself sought to promote. Likewise, critics who read Swift out of context are easily misled into taking his political statements at face value. In my two books on Swift, I attempted to read him historically and to redirect attention to the values and ideals that he sought to promote. The case of Burke is comparable but more complex, for he has been the subject of even more contradictory and incompatible interpretations than Swift. Since his death in 1797, out-of-context quotations from his writings and speeches have been continuously deployed to support a wide range of political agendas. In an attempt to recover the totality of the historical Burke, I wrote a lengthy biography in which I situate each of his major writings and speeches in its particular moment and context. The result, I hope, is a more nuanced portrait of a complex figure too often simplified to serve a particular ideological cause. It's also, I think, a book too long for anyone to read. My most recent work on Edward Gibbon tackles a historian who is also, like Swift and Burke, a great writer and a powerful thinker. If no longer consulted primarily for information about the history of the Roman Empire, he remains read for the intrinsic interest of his work. My book on him explores his use of numbers and numerical evidence to persuade as well as to inform. Although most historians, as far back as Herodotus, use numbers, my book is, perhaps surprisingly, the first to ask not so much whether their numbers were accurate or not, but what their rhetorical function was. When is an exact number more persuasive than an indefinite expression of quantity? The writers of newspaper headlines face this problem continuously, whether to prefer the authentic-sounding 889 people were drowned, or the more alarming, nearly 1,000 drowned. By careful examination of Gibbon's sources, I identify his skillful use of numerical evidence to enhance the persuasive value of his narrative and analysis. Gibbon interests me from another point of view. In his autobiography, he tells us that only his good fortune in being born into what he calls a middle station in life gave him the leisure to undertake and complete a long historical work. By chance, a mass of his financial records survives. I am currently analysing these to reconstruct his finances in detail, partly to discover the more complex truth behind the idealized self-portrait that he presents in his memoirs, and more generally to illustrate the life of an 18th century gentleman who was often rather hard-pressed to afford the trappings that his social status required, such as the supposed necessity to keep his own carriage. For those of you familiar with Jane Austen's novel Persuasion, he was something of a real-life Sir Walter Elliot. English, unfortunately, has no convenient term for writers whose works make truth claims different in kind from those made by poetry and fiction, and yet which also exhibit literary and rhetorical qualities of a high order. There are many such authors in the 18th century whose works remain of lasting value, and yet which are far from self-interpreting, and which need to be read both as historical documents and as literary or rhetorical constructs. I hope that my research has contributed to a more nuanced and historically valid understanding of what some of these great writers have to say to us, of the lives they lived, and of how their lives influenced their writings.
Thank you very much. Again, the floor is open for questions.
Who's your favorite?
My favourite author?
Of the three.
Oh, yes. Well, actually, currently Gibbon. But my favourite author really is Jane Austen. I always bring some allusion to her into every... There's always something that you can get from Jane Austen to decorate the driest pitch. But Gibbon is my current favourite.
So, which... what was the real category, social category where you put Gibbon?
Well,
he was just pretending he was somebody else.
he was in the middle state, but it was the middle of the top 1%. I mean, he says, you know, no work of genius could ever be written in a palace or a garret. And so you have the idea of him in the equivalent of the modern suburban three-bedroom house. But actually, he's right at the top of the social scale. So, I mean, what I'm trying to do is show people that when he talks about a middle state, it's not really where the middle was way below that.
Were these writers connected through kinship and close social ties, or were they rather disconnected with each other?
They were totally disconnected. The connection exists only in the thread of my autobiography that I start. I think, I mean, if one could be confessional about it, I think when I taught in Australia, Swift appealed to me as the great writer of exile. And when I left Australia and came to Canada, I no longer thought of myself in that kind of way. And so he stopped speaking to me and in that kind of way. And Burke was part of what I was 20 years ago. And no, I'm not that now. And Gibbon, I mean, I don't want to compare myself to Gibbon, but Gibbon is more me now, if I can put it that way. So that the trajectory is in my autobiography. That's what links those three. Well, it's aspirational to being in the middle of the top 1%.